morning. I'm Pat Thurston. My guest is Russ Baker. His book is Family of Secrets, The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. And, of course, we've barely scratched the surface, but you are going to stay with us a bit, aren't you, Russ?
I sure am.
Oh, yay. You know, I have to watch my clock because I keep running late because I get so involved in our discussions, and I have to go to the network news at the top, so I have to be careful about this. But I do want to get into the more about the Kennedy assassination, not just the whereabouts of George W., but Dulles and his relationship to the Kennedys, and the Kennedys' relationship to other individuals, and the people who didn't like the Kennedys, and the fact that John Kennedy didn't really like Allen Dulles, and I think he had even fired Allen Dulles. Yeah, and so let's get into some of that. We've got about 4 minutes. Do you think we have time to start?
We can certainly start.
Let's
yes.
start.
Okay. Well, first of all, when John Kennedy became president, the plans for the Bay of Pigs invasion were already underway, and he really didn't have much say in that. The invasion was just in the first few months that he was in office, and as we know, it was a disaster. They were trying to force Kennedy's hand to back this up with a full-fledged U.S. military invasion, and he absolutely refused. He said it's one thing if the exiles are going to go in, but we cannot be visibly involved with this. And in the end, because of what happened with the Bay of Pigs, he essentially had Allen Dulles resign, but I mean basically Dulles was forced out, and he'd been in for 10 years and he was planning to stay in for much longer. It's quite clear that Dulles was very, very unhappy with John F. Kennedy, and of course, and I quote in Family of Secrets a letter from his very dear friend Prescott Bush, who expresses his anger at what Kennedy did, and he says in this letter to Allen Dulles' widow some years later, "I never forgave the Kennedys for what they did to Allen." It's a very interesting letter. And so Dulles was forced out along with some of his top people, including a man who was the brother of the man who would be the mayor of Dallas at the time of the Kennedy assassination, which is very interesting.
So, all right. So the people who went along, who were also, went fired at the same time. They resigned at the same time.
They were
as
forced
Dulles?
out. Yes.
Okay. Were these the people who were involved in or trying to get Kennedy to go along with a full-fledged invasion of Cuba?
Yes, I mean there was no question that they were trying to force his hand.
Were these bad people?
He felt that he had been betrayed by them. They'd given him bad information. They had told him that there was much more popular support in Cuba, and that there was going to be this spontaneous uprising when this sort of limited number of exiles arrived there. And then when that didn't happen, they said, you've got to provide American air power. You've got to get the U.S. military into the act. And he said, absolutely not, because he knew the consequences of this, and we saw this, of course, later on with the Cuban Missile Crisis, how dangerous these things were.
Right.
By the way, in retrospect, we've learned particularly in the last few years, that our understanding of John F. Kennedy is all wrong. That Kennedy was actually a much stronger and more determined president. That he was battling the Pentagon. That he was battling very extreme, very hardline forces in the U.S. government that was just bristling. They wanted to go nuclear with the Soviets, and he thought these people were crazy. There are literally quotes where he says the generals are mad. The generals, the intelligence agency. Kennedy was battling with the U.S. steel industry. He was fighting with J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. His brother was taking on organized crime. These two brothers were going after everybody. There's never been an act like that.
In a short amount of time.
Yeah, there's never been an act like that in the history of this country,
yeah.
actually. They were very radical in a sense.
And as I understand it, Kennedy was, he outwitted many of his opponents, including the generals. We will come back because it is time for us to check in with the network news. But my guest stays with us, Russ Baker, and the book, of course, is Family of Secrets. You are invited to join us at 808810. That's 808. Good morning. I'm Pat Thurston, your host, here with you until 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm delighted Russ Baker continues with us. Russ is the author of Family of Secrets, the Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. Russ, we've got phone calls coming in. I do want to get to some more phone calls, and I also want to talk with you a bit about this other book that's sitting next to yours. I don't think you should put them too close together. It might be tainted. But before we do, I want to focus a little bit more on the Kennedy assassination. So, okay. John Kennedy made a lot of enemies within his own administration. People who were very powerful, people within the military and people within the intelligence agencies, so much so that he forced the director of the CIA to resign, and a bunch of his higher-ups had to go with him. Were they so angry that they would be willing to participate in the assassination of an American president?
Well, I wouldn't go as far as to say that. What I try to do with Family of Secrets, again, I'm coming at it from the vantage point of trying to explain these anomalies in the lives of the Bushes. In this case, George H.W. Bush not remembering where he was, November 22. The fact that these two memos show that, in fact, he knew where he was and that he was doing something. He had some keen interest in the assassination, that there were close ties between the Bush family and Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles was mad. There's no question he was mad. They were all mad at Kennedy. And by the way, I mean, there were all kinds of harebrained things going on. Have you heard of Operation Northwoods? This was a...
Yeah.
You know, I'm talking about, this was the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I mean, they came to Kennedy and they were so determined to take Fidel Castro out, and they were looking for an excuse, and they actually proposed that we have a false flag attack on the United States and blame it on Cuba.
Right.
And in this document, they actually say it might be necessary to incur civilian fatalities in the United States,
right,
in order to be able to do this larger good, to serve this larger good, which was to go in and attack Cuba. And so
they weren't above killing innocent people.
No, and Kennedy just thought these guys are crazy, and he was overruling them right and left. So you had a very, very delicate situation there to begin with. And as I say, they were also investigating all kinds of people. They were investigating people who, corruption that was going to go back toward LBJ himself, who was the vice president. Hoover was denying that the existence of La Cosa Nostra, of the mafia, and Robert Kennedy as Attorney General was just like a bat out of hell on all these issues. So they had everybody inflamed. I have a chapter in Family Secrets where I kind of lay out all of these elements that were angry with them. The oil industry was angry with them. Kennedy was thinking about getting rid of the oil depletion allowance, which was this huge boon and profit center, particularly for the independent oilmen in Texas. And so on issue after issue after issue, you have to know that John Kennedy, way back when he was a senator in the 1950s, he was a leading exponent of sort of kind of national liberation movements. He gave us a very controversial speech on the floor of the Senate where he said, let these countries, do their own thing. And of course, this was absolutely anathema to these power structures in the United States.
808810 is our telephone number, 808-0810. Let's talk with Everett. He's calling from Crescent City. Everett, hi, welcome to KGO. You're on with Russ Baker.
Hello,
Go ahead.
Pat. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks.
Good to talk to you again.
Yeah.
I have a very narrow and specific question.
Okay.
I'm wondering if there's any evidence that George H.W. Bush, when he was involved in intelligence and head of the CIA, was involved with fixing and or arranging election outcomes in foreign countries.
In foreign countries?
Yes.
The involvement of elements of American intelligence services with outcomes in foreign countries is well known, whether it was Chile or it was Guatemala or it was Iran or many, many other countries in the Congo. They were constantly involved in Vietnam early on. And so is there a high likelihood that George H.W. Bush continued in this tradition or even accelerated? Absolutely.
This is really disturbing. 808810 is the telephone number. Let's go to Mike in Livermore. Mike, hi, welcome to KGO. You're on with Russ Baker.
I'm wondering if your guest is familiar with the Council on Foreign Relations and Kennedy's connection with that. There have been a lot of presidents actually